This pre-recorded video is about covering some of the mathematical physics concepts or mathematical physics topics which are essential for this course, and in the course of the course we realize those are some of the topic which you have not learned yet, but they are essential for the course, and probably you are going to learn it later. I mean, not probably, definitely you are going to learn it later, but we cannot wait for till that point, and if you don't know all these topics in somewhat details, it will be difficult for you to follow the course. So for that reason I am making these supplementary videos which are to, as I said, like the supplement, the word supplement is very important here, just to emphasize on the fact that they are not the replacement of what you will learn in the actual mathematical physics course, but they will give you a overview of the topic or of the idea, such that you can at least proceed with the in the quantum mechanics course, and without knowing, without feeling awkward about this mathematical background. It is like when you first learn to do Newtonian mechanics, you learn to do it without using calculus, but the underlying concept is always like heavily calculus based, and later when you learn calculus you looked at all these things in a differently, or like in a much better way. So it is similar. So you are learning all these concepts even without using this, or using it in without knowing all the how these mathematical things are working. You are using it in quantum mechanics, but it is better if you learn it, then you will start to see things in a much deeper way. And the second keyword here is the physical mathematics, is to emphasize on the fact. So I will cover the mathematical topics in a physical way, always keeping an eye towards the physical problem at hand, or at least, even if that physical problem is not quantum mechanics, but at least some other physics, a classical physics problem in hand, like not strictly in a mathematical way where you start with an axiom and definition and try to prove it and in a mathematical way, but rather we will build up things in a from a much more heuristic approach. So the main topic I will cover here is the idea of Fourier transformation and how they are heavily used in the context of quantum mechanics. And as a background, I will assume you know the vector space and all that, and as we know that we have used it already and you have learned it quite well, so that was not the problematic part. Both the abstract concept of vector space and also the operational concept of vectors and matrix and all that, so that is not the problematic part. The problematic part was when we wanted to stretch it in infinite dimension, and when we wanted to use these concepts in the context of Fourier transformation. So let's recap some of the ideas briefly which you know very well, just to connect it such that I can connect it easily with these new ideas. So what is a vector? A vector is an abstract object which you know has a property that you naively know it is something which points has a direction and magnitude, but you know more advanced definition that it transforms in a certain way and all that. So the vectors which is like in an the vector, as you know, the vector which points in as a arrow in some direction, that can be expressed in terms of its in some orthogonal basis. Let's say if V is a 2D vector, it can be written as its two components of Vx and Vy, and you know this definition is true even for more abstract things which cannot be visualized as a arrow. And so what are these Vx and Vi? They are basically projection of the vector V along this orthogonal basis. And similarly you can take another basis which is let's call it I prime and j prime in the same, in some other and express the same vector in that other basis, and the components will be Vx prime and Vi prime, and these will be again projection along these components. So in an abstract notation you write this vector as this two component object in the first basis, which is I cap j cap, and as b prime bx prime by prime in the second basis. And you know, there is always, if there are two bases, you can go from one basis to another in terms of some transformation, and since you have written in this way, the transformation has to be the 2 by 2 matrix. And we have also realized that since it is the same vector that is being expressed in these two different bases, there has to be something we can say about this matrix from there, and that what we can say is that this matrix must be orthogonal. So basically, so I already had written it, so it must be orthogonal, and that comes from the fact that it is expressing basically the same vector. And so now by that I mean, if you multiply it with bx by and you want to multiply it bx prime by prime, since they are same vector, they will produce the same magnitude, and that's why you will get in order to get that, you have to multiply the r by r transpose r, and that must be equal to 1. So now I can generalize this idea into arbitrary n dimension, and these are my n dimensional basis vectors. And again I can write the components or the projections as the projection of the vector along this particular basis vector, and similarly I can do that along another set of basis vectors, and I can go from E basis to H basis with the R transformation, just generalizing this idea. And we also know that these generic projections can be thought of, a projection of a vector v along another vector u can be thought of as the dot product of these two vectors divided by the magnitude of the u vector, because I want to see the v along the u. So u must be just a direction. So that is the same idea here. Here the u is ei, and its modulus is unity, because it's like just a direction. So that's why you write it as this kind of, in this kind of way. So now we generalize these ideas in the context of more abstract vector spaces, where we represent a vector as a kate. And we know that even if I mean, this is generally true for any vector, that you can write it along its so if a prime forms an orthogonal basis, orthonormal basis, then you can use the resolution of identity and express the abstract vector alpha in this orthonormal basis, and write it as because this alpha forms an orthonormal basis, you should be able to write it, at least in principle. I mean, if it forms an orthonormal basis, there should be some resolution of identity. So using that, you can write it in this way. So where this tells you the projection, this is the projection part, not this, and this is the resolution of identity part, and that tells you what is the in a similar way how you can express that abstract vector a in this along this basis. So again I can rewrite this as the projection operator a prime, which selects the component of this vector along the axis or along the basis vector a prime, and that is basically the same concept. Now there is nothing change, there is no change when you consider that vectors to has some restrictive properties, such as the vector must be a ray, which means it has this unitary it has this property that this thing must be 1. So they don't represent anymore a direction, anymore a whole vector, but just a direction in space. And eventually you know that when this kind of property holds, and you say that the vector space is some complex space, so then you can have an arbitrary phase alpha attached to this vector. So it is like e to the power I, like I theta, let me call it theta, which, so these and these represent basically the same vector, because when you take an inner product, it doesn't matter that which vector you are representing. And the only thing matters is that when you take a inner product between a alpha and a beta, so the only thing matter is the angle between, or the relative orientation between two of these rays, and the orientation of a ray itself, or the direction or magnitude, none of this matters. So that is the meaning of that it belongs to a projective space, and it can have a complex amplitude. So this whole thing together is known as the Hilbert space. So all these things we have gone through already. I am just recapping that. So now the requirement that this any quantum mechanical state must be represented by this kind of a state gate or array that we already established, and that means they must in order to satisfy this property. So let's keep that property in mind, and we'll see what this property takes us to. So now let me take another set of basis state, which is B prime and X space. So you can think this thing normally in the quantum mechanical context, these basis states are found as when you try to measure something that you already seen, and they forms the eigengate of some operator. So similarly, A primes are eigengate of the A operator, and B primes are eigengates of this B operator. So when you have this another set of basis gates, and then you can write it again like this, and if you want to now know that what is the transformation that takes you from here to here, like you know it here. So let's say you consider this transformation to be U, and when that so that U must satisfy the property that U dagger U is 1, because of the requirement that this alpha because of this requirement that this alpha must be a ray. So when that property is there, so then you can establish a relation between the components of alpha along A prime and components of alpha along B prime. So this is again equivalent to writing it in this form, and that is given by this U matrix. So that is basically the transformation in the same language. We have gone through all this. So now we want to stretch this idea in a little unfamiliar territory, which some of you might it might be new and uncomfortable for some of you, as when we presented it in the main lecture. So that's why I am repeating all these things here. So the idea is that an arbitrary function can be seen as a vector. So how it is like that? So let's say I have a function which starts here at the origin. This is not a requirement immediately, but we will see that certain things changes when that requirement is not there. That thing is not true in quantum mechanical context. So let me just without loss of too much of generality, let me assume there is a function which is like this, like an arbitrary function. So it is starts at point x equal to 0 and ends at point x equal to L, and then this is the okay, let me say this is the domain of the function, not the range. So and now I want to represent this function. So there are, of course, this is a real number line, which means there are infinitely many points. So let's say I now want to sample this function with some discrete point. So I divide this domain into n points, and I write, so when I do that, I write the function as fnx. So this so now this fnx can be visualized as if each point in the x space is a orthogonal basis vector, is an orthogonal basis vector. So this fn can now be written as an n component function, whose components are basically the value of the function at that point. So it is fnx1, fnx2, fnx3. So I can form it like n numbers and write it like a vector, and then I can use this idea to write the fn as xi, as this kind of, because I assume this xi forms a orthonormal basis, and I can write it like that. Then this whole picture makes perfect sense. But there is a problem, a little bit of problem in this picture, because there is we didn't prove very rigorously that this xi form a orthonormal basis. So it turns out such a proof is actually an axiomatic thing, like we think it like a postulate in the context of quantum mechanics, that the continuous space forms a orthonormal basis, and also in the context of mathematics we take it like a postulate and build up this whole thing like that. And we will see that this postulate makes totally sense with this starting, usually the mathematics has this axiomatic or postulate structure, where you start with some postulate and build up an entire empire, and in this case this empire completely fits with the function, as we know, the function space, and also completely fits with the kind of thing we want to describe in the context of quantum mechanics. So let's start with this postulate. And why is this postulate? Because as I have told you that there is no way you can always find all these orthonormal basis vectors, because there are infinitely many. And so in this case I have sampled the function as fn, like n points, but this n can be easily be taken to infinity because this is a real number line. So in reality it's an infinite dimensional vector, and there is no way to guarantee that this thing is true, but if I assume this thing is true, then everything else makes sense. Okay, so now let me write it in a more familiar way. Let me write down this axiomatic xi basis vector in this form. So where it is 0 0 0 0 1 and 0 0 0 like that, 1 is in the ith place. So for x1 it is like 1 0 0 0 0 like that, for x2 it is like 0 1 0 0 0 like that, and so on. So then this whole thing makes perfect sense, because now this fn ket can be written in terms of like fn x1, which is the projection of that vector along this basis vector, and that is basically the numerical value of the function at that point x1, and so on. And similarly for x2 and xn I can write it like that, and then it perfectly makes sense with the way we express a vector. And here is the axiomatic part, or the postulate. I would like or I can say this is the postulate, which tells me this forms an orthonormal basket and satisfy this. Now we will see in a moment that we will not do it exactly like that when n is truly infinity. So I am writing this assuming that n is still some finite number. Okay, so now so you can try to see that whether it makes sense for some finite n dimension. So I mean to say like not 2-3 dimension, but maybe some finite like n equal to 20 or something. You can check that this how these things make sense. So here is what we get after all this, that this function can be thought of as an n-dimensional vector in this n-dimensional vector space whose basis vectors are this, and these are the projection of the function or the vector fn along this basis. So starting from this picture, so we can now go to describe about an inner product, which is let's say fngn is some inner product with this n point sampling. So I put our favorite completeness form, and then I can write it as a fn xi and gn xi, like as a product of these two. So this is the conjugate of this. So if this is a column vector, this is like a row vector, and if these things are complex, so we have not yet assumed that they are complex, so then they must be the complex conjugate. So this will be basically, if complex, then it will be something like this. So that is basically the it is effectively the product between the functions. So in a similar way we can define the inner product of the function of the fn vector with itself, which is basically just mod squared sum. And if they are orthogonal, these two functions are orthogonal, then we can expect that their inner product should be 0, and we will see examples of that what kind of functions will be called orthogonal. Those functions are those whose overlap is 0. Okay, so now I want to truly go to the n equal to infinity limit and rewrite these summations as integrals. So what happens when this is the usual rule of how you convert a sum into an integral by the Riemann sum, and here you basically divide the range of the function 0 to L into n components, where each component has a width delta that is equal to L by n plus 1, and assume that because the n is infinity and delta is almost 0, you assume that within this width that this is like almost a point, and there the function, like these functions take like a uniform value within this tiny range. So now you can basically just sum over this whole thing with product of delta, because you assume it is uniform in this range of delta. So this is like a width of this this domain. So now when all these things are truly 0, you know this thing is basically nothing but the integral, and so the fg inner product can be written as fg. This is a simple thing which we have done many times. It's basically product of two functions. This is a conjugate, so product of two functions, and similarly ff is basically just fx mod square dx. So if they are complex, as I said, then it will be just f star x dx. So this is the familiar concept of the taking product of two function and integrating it over a domain to see what is the overlap between two functions. But now we are expressing these ideas or getting this idea from the concept of viewing the function as an infinite dimensional vector space, and as we can see, this whole these two things perfectly fits. Okay, so now we will come a little bit tricky, several tricky issues of visualizing a continuous infinite dimensional space as a vector space, and we will see there are certain things, there are certain delicate things which you have to treat a little more carefully. So the first thing of this is that so this expectation that this, if I take two basis vectors x prime and x who are not different, their overlap must be 0, that means they are orthogonal. But now we want to examine that, do we really want, when x prime is equal to x, this thing to be 1? So that means we want it to be orthonormal, but what is the real purpose of making it orthonormal? So let us see that what is the real purpose of getting it orthonormal in our context, which is this quantum mechanical problem. So the real purpose of getting it to be orthonormal is to set this f arbitrary, two arbitrary, absolutely arbitrary vector f's, to arbitrary vector f's inner product to be equal to 1. So that is the real purpose of that. And why it is so? Because we know that this thing basically represents this thing, this inner product represents basically a sum of the probability amplitudes. So if I introduce the resolution of identity here, I can write this thing as fx mod square, and this is basically, in the quantum mechanical context, we identify this fx as the wave function psi x. So psi x mod square represents the probability, and I want the sum of the probability, total probability, to be 1. That is the property of probability. So in order for this to be true, what kind of property exactly do we need in this continuous infinite dimensional space? So let us see the form of, let us try to explore the form. So we have, since we have assumed this x prime and x prime like are basis vectors, so they must satisfy the completeness, and so this completeness is basically the x prime outer product sum over all the x primes, and that is equal to identity and infinite dimensional identity matrix. So now if I put an x and f like Kate, bra and Kate in these two sides, like this is the Kate, this is the bra, and then this thing basically is the identity, of course, because I am just taking the identity and putting the x and f in these two sides. So this is nothing but the xf. So now if I write it in the language of functions, this is basically my fx prime, this is fx, and this guy is some function, let me call it xx prime, which allows me to write this kind of a form. So what kind of property does this xx prime holds? So let us examine that. So it must be a function which fires only at x equal to x prime and does not fire anywhere else. So if that happens, so it is some sort of a sampling function which in the entire domain of the x, which is a to b, it just samples the point x equal to x prime, and such that that is why this entire sum or entire integral returns me only fx. So if I want to visualize it, I can plot the fx prime against x prime here, and I can see it should be a function like that which only fires at x prime equal to x, such that this whole sum just samples the point fx, the special point fx. Okay. So now if that is true, then what kind of property do I expect for this? What more can I say about this delta function? So let us say, I narrow down this region, this sample region, to at some width x epsilon, like this width is, let us say this width is epsilon. So then this function should fire only in this range, and I take the limit epsilon going to 0. So if epsilon is truly going to approaching to 0, then fx must be constant in that range, because it is almost 0. So then I can take this out, and that gives me this form. So this should be the property of this delta function. Now you might be naively tempted to think, why can't I assume that this guy is just 1 here and 0 everywhere else, this delta xx prime. So, the problem of assuming that is that now if when you have this integral form that this must be this must satisfy this property, then this tells you if this is a finite object like 1 and this is an infinitesimal object, this integral range is also infinitesimal, then this thing can no way be 1, no way can truly be 1. So, this is like infinitesimal, infinitesimal and finite, it should be in fact 0 in the epsilon going to 0 limit. So, in order this to be a finite number 1, this delta cannot be a finite object, this has to be an infinite object. So, that is why this thing is a little delicate to handle. So, this property makes perfect sense that this must satisfy this property, that, and also notice that this thing entirely depends on the distance between x and x prime and not the value of the x and x prime itself. So, as you go away it must be 0, and when it is 0, so then it must be the distance is 0, then only it is finite. So, I can now write this x prime as x minus x prime. So, now when I put all these together, then the best definition you can give about this function is a function which is non-zero everywhere between x to x prime, and it must satisfy this property. It must satisfy this property. When you and then you can you cannot define it exactly at the point x prime. If you try to do, then it must be infinity, because unless otherwise this integral will not make sense, and this is an integral you definitely need for this thing to give you this kind of property. So, this is the definition of delta function, that is something you have learned already, and it is just probably a repetition for you. So, what it tells you eventually that this function, so now you want to go back here and represent this x prime x inner product as some in some delta function form. So, you want to, when it was a discrete object, you just wrote it as Kronecker delta, but now you want to write it as this form, but it is something which is 0 everywhere, but when it comes at x equal to 1, it is not 0, it is an infinite, it is infinite there. Truly speaking, it is infinite, but that is not a problem, because it perfectly lets you do all the other things, which is like f inner product must be equal to 1 because of this kind of relations. So, that is what you want, but that breaks you away from strictly from the domain of functions which has unit magnitude. So, in that sense, the square integrable functions are not strictly satisfying the properties of being a kth, but it still is giving you all other desirable properties. So, that is why you say that they are like in this is the Hilbert space, the truly defined finite dimensional vector space, and these guys are like somewhere in very neighborhood, in very close, but they are not exactly into this, but both of them represents and good enough to represent the physical properties of a wave function. A space. Okay. So, the physical Hilbert space. So, to safely say, the physical Hilbert space is basically this entire domain. So, this plus this, and for infinite dimensional vectors, it is this domain where it satisfies this, and finite dimensional vector, it is this. Okay. So, that is what I wanted to establish here. And so, now let us come to the domain of a concept called integral transformation. So, this is something we will use heavily in various contexts in physics, all across physics, but here what I want to do is I want to give you a very broad overview at what kind of objects these are, and then we will go in detail of one of this type of objects or one of this type of concepts of integral transformation, and we will explore the details properties of that. So, I strongly recommend you of okay. So, let me, before I recommend you anything, let me define what it is. So, a integral transformation is a operator. Strictly speaking, it's an operator. It's a program to map a function from its original function space to another function space via integration. Okay. So, why I want to do such a thing? Because it will turn out that sometimes this map can make the function in the other function space easier to manipulate. So you will see, strictly speaking, it is very similar to something called a basis transformation of a vector that I will show you in a moment. And why you do this basis transformation of a vector, go from one set of coordinates or one orthogonal basis to another orthogonal basis, because it becomes the vector sometimes looks simpler and easier to read and manipulate and all that, and it is exactly the same for functions. If you view the functions as a infinite dimensional vector, then it makes perfect sense, and these two things becomes basically the same thing. And but even if you don't go in that domain, because these subjects were developed in parallel without introducing the language of vector space, so you can think it is just a function in some domain x which is transformed to another function, let me call this the transform function, in another domain P, and via some integration, and the object which allows it to transform this function into that domain is called a kernel of this transformation. And this like these kernels are like a operator. Why I am calling it an operator, it will be clear in a moment when I bring the vector space language. And also to notice that some of these kernels have a inverse, which means if I can go, these kernels act as a bridge between these functions to this function. So I can also obtain the reverse this transformation, like I can also obtain the function in the original domain, or like in this domain from this domain by applying an inverse of this kernel. So this is we will again see this is exactly same as having a vector transformation or a matrix having inverse when I bring in the vector space language, and in that language this whole program will make perfect sense. So some kernels can be again symmetric, like xp and px exchange will not matter, and this is the kind of kernels which will be of our interest in the context of this course. Okay, so now let me view this whole program of integral transformation as a vector space problem. So let me say that these two spaces, these two domains of function, let me view them as two complete set of bases. So they must have this property that x prime equal to 1, equal to 1. So then the function can be expressed either in the x basis or in the p basis. So this is nothing but the fx and this is nothing but the px. So now I can write take the p here and I mean take this and apply the p bra here. So then this becomes some p bra x prime ket, and this becomes x prime f, and we know this is nothing but the function in the p domain and this is the function in the x domain. And sometimes it is a little better because the function need not to have the exact same form, so it is little better to write it as some f prime, but it is also okay to just write it as f x prime. And this guy acts as a kernel or of taking it from this space to this space. And now we know that this transformation from going from one space to another space in the vector language, they are like matrix, so they should have an inverse in well behaved cases, not necessarily all matrix has a inverse. So then this whole business of integral transformation is viewed here as a linear operation from going from one space to another space. So in the context of, so we will learn specifically deal with a integral transformation called a Fourier transformation, where this kxp, this thing will be e to the power I x, this kernel. But this is not the only thing, there is a whole world of integral transformation. So I recommend you to go to this Wikipedia page of integral transformation, where the list of all kind of things are given. And in the context of physics, you will learn like various other like things called Laplace transformation. If you go learn quantum field theory, you will learn something called Mellin transformation, and there is another very important one called Weyl transformation, which allows you to develop a semi-classical formulation of quantum mechanics. So all these things you will learn later at some point or the other, but here in this course for the immediate need I want you to understand about Fourier transformation. So now let me be specific that what happens, what are the special and specific properties of Fourier transformation. So, the basic idea of Fourier transformation is originated from the idea of Fourier series, and the idea is following. So, we know Fourier series by now quite well, that any periodic function S x can be composed of harmonically related sinusoidal combined with an weighted summation. So, that basically tells you if you add sinusoidals with proper weight, you can construct any periodic function from there. So, that means let us say I have a square wave pattern. So, that can be viewed as a sinusoidal, like I can add these sinusoidals with proper weight and get it from there, and this is the kind of example you must have done. So, a square, a waveform of this like triangular form and all that. And this thing, so how do I know what is the exact component? For that, you have to integrate this thing, and you can show this just the property of this trigonometric integrals, that this am can be obtained by this integral, and bm is by this integral. So, that might now with this connection, that might remind you about just by like knowing that how to know the an by some sort of an inverse transformation, and that is exactly equivalent to that, but we will see it in more detail for the Fourier transformation. So, that is the idea of Fourier series. Now, this thing can be also written in terms of a phase and a purely cosine wave, or it can be written in the complex exponential form, and that is basically the idea which you learned in the context of a periodic signal processing, where you want to understand how any periodic signal is composed of pure waves, pure sinusoidal waves. So, now this idea is stretched when if you try to stretch it in the context of any function, not just periodic function, any aperiodic function, of course, an well behaved aperiodic function, then this idea takes the form of this Fourier theorem, that is called and that gives you this thing called Fourier transform. So, that tells you if any function f x can be expressed in terms of a bunch of oscillating functions, or again a bunch of sinusoidals with an appropriate weight, and that weight, so here it must be p. So, that weight is basically given by the projection of the function along this oscillator or along this sinusoidal. So, that is exactly like the idea of what we just learned here. So, this function is my fp, and then I am trying to express it in terms of this guy is my sinusoidal, and this is the projection. So, we will see in a moment in much more details. So, I can write it as like some, okay. So, here I wrote it in an inverse way. So, this f x is written as some fp e to the power I p x, where this I p x represents the plane waves, because this is basically you can think it as a circle e to the power I p x, a unit radius circle, where this point is basically some angle x, and the p tells you how fast this point traverses in this circle. So, that is basically that is why these things are called the plane waves, and if you have it give it some modulus, then of course, it will be a circle of different radius and so on. So, this is basically this plane wave, and this is the coefficient or the projection of the function along that plane wave. So, again now because it is a continuous space, so that means you have to sum over all the possible frequencies of this plane wave, and this sum is now represented by all the continuous frequencies which is lying on a real number line. So, now this is written in the form of a integral. Now, you must be careful to notice that all these things x, p and are real, because if they are complex, then it will have a component which is not which may not be e to the power I p x, it will be some just p x or minus p x, and that part constitutes a different kind of transformation called Laplace transformation. So, you can also discuss it in this generic context of Fourier transform, but here we will not do that. Here we will only bother ourselves when x and p are real. So, now this reminds you again of the vector space structure. It tells you it is basically the vector f is written in some basis p, and this the projection of the vector f along this p is just f prime p, and that is basically nothing but your FP, and this basis is some kind of a plane wave basis, and that you get when you bring in an x here. So this basic basis will give you some plane wave basis. So that is basically now the connection between Fourier transform and this vector space transformation. So now starting from that, I can now construct this, go back to this definition of Fourier transformation as we defined the when I define the integral transformation. It is basically a transformation which lets you go from express a function in the x space into in the p space, and then you allows you to go back, like starting from this fp, you can go to this fx through this transformation. And this guy, of course, from here you know, you can guess that this guy, when you go to this other way, when you go from p to x, then it will be something like this. So it will be p f, like, then first you express this f in the x prime direction, dx prime. So this is your fx and this is your fp, and this, so now you want to put this p here. So if this this is xp prime, it is some complex function ikx, so this thing must be e to the power minus, sorry, ipx, this thing must be e to the power minus ipx. So this is an infinite dimensional the inner product of these two infinite dimensional gate, and that must represent a conjugate of that number. Okay, so now this whole picture makes sense in together, and then you can think again this this thing entirely like a projection, this thing entirely like a projection, and this like a basis. So this is basically telling the same thing, that you are expressing a function into a plane wave basis. So this projection is nothing but, again, in the definition of v dot u by u modulus, is basically, this is the v and this is the u, and this is the u modulus, which is unitary. And we have seen earlier that this thing, instead of taking it to be 1, if we take it to be root 2 pi, that helps me with bringing this thing to be ff inner product to be equal to 1. And for that reason, we will define the Fourier transform to be with a 1 by root 2 pi coefficient without the loss of any generality. So in the context of quantum mechanics, because of this requirement, we want it to be to put as 1 by root 2 pi prefactor, and then the full definition of Fourier transform becomes like this. Okay, so now let's notice some interesting properties of delta function as we defined to help to make sense of this definition of Fourier transform. So notice now the Fourier transform, this fp is written as this is nothing but a repetition of that formula, and then fx I can write it with just a defined variable fx prime in this form. So here in this fx prime there is an fp inside it, so without a loss of any generality, because this is a dummy index, that's why I want it to be different here. So I can write the fp and put this from the first formula like this. So now notice this exactly fits into the definition of a delta function, because the definition of delta function was that if I do an integral over this x space, this should give me this at x prime. So this is nothing but the x prime minus x. So if I write it precisely, so this is basically delta x minus x prime is basically this guy. Now you can think it this x minus x prime. So here I should write it as here I should write it as dp. So now if you notice, if I take this x minus x prime as a variable y, so I can write it as this. So now this is nothing but, again, within the definition of Fourier transformation, this is nothing but a type of Fourier transformation of the function unity. Of the function is nothing but a constant 1, and that Fourier transform is delta function. Of course, there is ambiguity in this prefactor, but as I said, this prefactor can be chosen. Here I make this specific choice to such that it satisfies this requirement. Okay, now I want you to convince all these arguments, these abstract arguments, in terms of doing with some checks with delta function, which I will demonstrate you at the end of this lecture, and this will help you to visualize this whole program. This whole this will help you to visualize that if this whole things are, all these things are true. and of course this if this abstract language is totally making sense to you, then you don't need that. I mean, it is not yet too abstract, but you can still play with this function and see that if you add a bunch of sinusoidals, which means if you do this following numerical experiment, that if you take a e to the power I k x and let that k run from some minus L to plus L in steps of, let's say, delta L. So so the purpose of this program is to let you do that write down a code which will do that, and so it will be written as cos kx plus I sin kx. So you basically add these two components separately, and you will see that when you take this delta L to be smaller and smaller and L to be larger and larger, you will basically start getting a plot like this. So when you add this cosine, so this when you add just two functions, so let's say you have one function like that and another function, the k is slightly different like that, and then the third k is slightly different like that, and of course since it goes in the minus direction also, then there is also a fourth k which is something like goes in this direction and all that. So when you add all of them together, they are guaranteed to be 1 at the origin for the cosine part. So when you add all of them, it will give you some property like this, and if you keep add infinity of many of like L tends to infinity, delta L tends to 0, this function will keep growing like that as you have defined the delta function. The sine part will of course have nothing like this, it will go to 0 and it will do like some kind of destructive interference everywhere. So in this complex plane, it will look like something like this, a one single peak at the origin. So this is the x direction, and this is the okay, so wait, so this is the real direction, this is the imaginary direction, and this will look like one single line, and the line will go bigger and bigger as you add more and more points. So this is this visualization. I will show you using some mathematical code. And to have further visualization about this projection operation and this projection property, so by the way, you can check any Fourier transformation by doing this kind of numerical experiment, and like any arbitrary function, as you know that what fx and fk are there, like fp to the minus ip plus fpx. So take any pair of Fourier pair, go to Wikipedia and check the Fourier pairs and do this kind of check, and you will of course learn how to do this using this delta function and all that. Like if you have an arbitrary unknown function, if you know how to do this integral, let's say you want to find the Fourier transformation of some function e to the power x. So then you take this e to the power p. So if you take e to the power p and do e to the power ep to be ipx or some other any arbitrary function, you can do this integral and see what that fx should be, and you can also convince you by doing this tiny numerical experiments that it is indeed true. It is just a fact that how you should add waves with certain weight, and that that should give you. And for further visualization, I will recommend you to go to this site and check and see how one can visualize this whole process as a vector problem. Okay, so that is basically the part 1. And the part 2, I will talk about bring these whole things in the context of quantum mechanics.